Hi everyone, welcome to the January 25th edition of the TimeformUS Forecast. I'm David Aragona here with my usual co-host Craig Mulkowski, and this is the Pegasus World Cup edition of the forecast. We'll be focusing on that Pegasus World Cup Saturday card at Gulfstream Park, particularly the late pick 5 sequence, races 9 through 13, all stakes, of course, all graded stakes, including both of the grade 1 Pegasus World Cup races, the Turf and the main event going as the last race and the final leg of this pick 5 sequence. Also in there are the Pegasus World Cup Filly and Mare Turf. That's a grade 2 event. That's the second leg of the sequence. And then a pair of dirt races, the Inside Information and the Fred Hooper, both around one turn for the older runners. Craig, this is not an easy sequence to handicap, especially if you want to get creative in some of these races, which I think you definitely can. This ticket could easily get bloated, but we're going to try to talk through and give people some strategies to be successful.
Right. We're recording this early this week because the PPs have been out so long, and I'll be upfront. I have no idea if I'm going to play this pick 5 or not, but I'll kind of talk about the races and see. Maybe it sometimes us just doing the show makes me have an opinion and kind of make that decision. We still got a few days to go, but I do like these races. I think it's a good set of races. It's certainly not easy, and will test anybody trying to hit this sequence.
Yeah, I mean, it's great to see a card like this get put together. There's been a lot of chatter this week on social media about how this has been one of the most fun cards to handicap that we've seen in quite a while. I mean, obviously, everyone looks forward to the Breeders' Cup every year, Belmont Stakes Day, but this particular card, I think, in large part due to the absence of some big names when the stars don't come out on a day like this, the field sizes tend to increase. And I think we've seen that throughout the day. Maybe they aren't the big names like the Arrogates and the Gun Runners that we saw in past years, even going down the undercard, but they're fun, competitive races throughout the day. So a lot to sink your teeth into from a handicapping and wagering standpoint. And if you really have some strong opinions, you're looking to get even more involved than we're going to talk about on this podcast, you should be aware that the Pegasus World Cup Betting Championship is also occurring on Pegasus World Cup Day this Saturday, January 27th. First is seeding at the prize pool with $50,000 of their own cash. You can buy your way in for $6,000. $5,000 of that goes to the live tournament bankroll, and $1,000 goes to the prizes. So with 200 players participating, that's a prize pool of $250,000. And in terms of the prizes, huge stacks of cash, BCBC seats, NHC seats, and seats to the new and improved Ultimate Betting Challenge. You can play in the Pegasus World Cup Betting Championship online at ExpressBet or on track at Gulfstream Park or Santa Anita. Think you have what it takes? Head on over to pwcbc.com for registration and more information. Well, Craig, we're not going to get quite that ambitious on this podcast talking about contest play. I'll save that for some others who are a little more well-versed in that, but we are going to tackle a pretty tough pick 5 sequence. And we did record some videos. We should tell people at the start of this. We did 4 stakes previews this morning. As you said, we're recording this on Wednesday, including going through horse-by-horse analysis of the Pegasus World Cup Turf and the Pegasus World Cup. I think we had some fun disagreements in maybe a couple of those races that we'll get to a little bit later. But the first 3 legs of the sequence, I know we haven't talked about yet. So it's going to be fun to go through this with you.
It is. I'm glad I'm not in the contest because the whole card is really pretty tough. I have a good friend who's been bugging me about the contest, a guy named Corey who I stayed with at the Breeders' Cup, and I'll almost be glad when this is over so I don't have to hear from him about it anymore. But I just kid with him. He actually has a lot of success in contest, and I know he'll be listening. So it's hats off to the people that spend the money and take those chances in these things. I know they can't be very easy.
No, I mean, I admire people who are able to think about the races from those multiple standpoints, the parimutuel racing, the contest play. It's something that I haven't spent a whole lot of time, pursuing, just given other duties that I have in this industry. But I know some people are really passionate about it, and I agree. My hat's off to them. Well, Craig, let's get into the handicapping from our standpoint that's tackling this pick 5 sequence. It'll begin with race 9. It is the Inside Information grade 2 event, 7 furlongs on the dirt for the fillies and mares. And I don't know about you, Craig, but as I started to go through this field, it felt like there was quite a bit of filler in here. I think we see a little bit of filler in general on Pegasus World Cup Day. It seems like the there are some ownership groups, some connections that just want to have a horse in on this big day. And I think Gulfstream tries to prioritize that, and you get big fields in that way. But from a handicapping standpoint, I think that there are some you can eliminate as you go through this. And I found myself having some trouble making a case against the likely favorite in this race. We're recording this so early, we haven't yet seen the morning lines. As of Wednesday afternoon, I don't think they're out yet, but I'm anticipating that the favorite is going to be the number 9, Mary Quite Contrary. And I'll be pretty upfront, Craig, in starting off this race. This is not a favorite I have that much interest in trying to beat.
Yeah, I kind of had the same thoughts. I was going through, and part of that is because the later races are so tough. I mean, it would be hard to spread wide in this race. But as I look through the PPs, as you said, there's definitely some filler. There's a lot of horses that they all kind of run in the low 100 to mid 100 TimeformUS speed figures. And I think on her best day, she's just better than that. I was trying to make a case for some others and didn't come up with them. I'll talk about just a couple, but I would lean heavily on Mary Quite Contrary if I'm going to play this. Gerrymander's one who I assume is going to take some money. I think you can give her a little bit of an excuse for the go for wand last time. Her figures kind of fit in here, so I don't want to totally dismiss her. I think she had an excuse on that biased track that day. I know we both actually like Dr. B quite a bit, but she's tried 7 furlongs twice. It didn't go very well for her, but they were both off of long layoffs, so maybe she wasn't fully cranked. I don't want to totally give up on her. Then the horse to the outside, Olivia Darling, was one who I had a little interest in as I was reading the comments. And then I went and watched the race, and it just reminded me you can't always trust what's in the chart call. And those guys have a tough job. I'm not trying to knock them, but if you read it, it basically said this horse was 5 wide all the way around the track. And when you watch the replay, I actually think this horse got a fine trip. So I was a little more lukewarm on that. I don't think the horse was anywhere near that wide. So it sounds like we've kind of the same conclusion. I would go pretty short in here with most of my play on Mary Quite Contrary.
Yeah, I mean, the importance of watching replays cannot be overstated. Just going by the chart comments can be very misleading. There's a chart call later that I'll try to remember to bring up that's just completely wrong. I actually even think we reported it, but for some reason it still hasn't been corrected. I'll get to that a little bit later. As for Mary Quite Contrary, I mean, Craig, she just shows up every time when she's spotted appropriately, and that's typically been the case when she's run at Gulfstream. She's run well in every single start here, and that loss to back as the favorite in the Princess Rooney doesn't look so bad in retrospect when you consider that 3 Witches came back and was 3rd in the Breeders' Cup Filly and Mare Sprint off that performance. So she just seems rock solid. It's easy to make an excuse for her 2 tries against Echo Zulu and Goodnight Olive and the Ballerina. I mean, the Ballerina was probably the toughest race in the entire division last year. Let's not hold that against her. And what I liked watching her last race, going a mile, was that she was a little more engaged early. She was actually kind of keen down the backstretch in her first start off the trainer switch to Eddie Pliza. And you want to see that from a horse like this, who sometimes can drop a little too far back. If she's a little more engaged early in this race and doesn't have quite so much ground to make up, I think that could bode well for her. So I just viewed her as a horse that I wanted to lean on in the first leg of this sequence. With it being the first leg, I don't feel so bad about doing that because I still have plenty of options open. If I'm wrong about Mary Quite Contrary, I move on to the next leg and I have a pick 4 at my disposal I can play. Maybe the advantages aren't as great as they are in the pick 5, but I still think that I like some value horses throughout the sequence. So I'll have some avenues for me to still extract something from it. As for others that I could use as backups, I was kind of struggling to come up with somebody that I liked nearly as much. You pointed out Gerrymander, and she's fine. She fits on speed figures. You can't argue that. At the end of the day, though, Craig, she's just Gerrymander, and she doesn't really win that much. She gets good trips and doesn't seem to capitalize on them. Her only recent victory was in that match race where the other horse was eased, and I can give her the excuse she was chasing outside on Cigar Mile Day last time, not where you wanted to be, but you still wanted to see her put up a little more of a fight, and that's just her. She seems a little faint-hearted. So I didn't want to trust her, especially since she's a horse that seems like she does her best running when she's forward, and there's other speed in this race. And while I don't like her at all from a win standpoint, or even to finish anywhere, I think you have to talk about the presence of the number 7 Sassy Nature, who is a really fast turf sprinter. Has run okay on dirt on occasion, but I mean, lately she's been a pure 5.5 furlong sprinter, and she's pretty quick. She can probably handle the dirt well enough to be clear of this field early, but what I'm trying to say is if she comes apart, I think it makes it a little hard on the horses that have to chase her early.
I agree. She's a horse that started her career on dirt and ran fine, and then they switched her over to turf. Her debut didn't go well, but her next two were good, and her speed figures aren't much different than what she's been running on turf. The problem with her, I think, is the distance. She's just 7 furlongs seems a little bit out of reach for me. And she's another reason that I just think Mary Quite Contrary really fits in here, because I think she's going to set it up and give plenty of pace. And I agree, it's going to make it tough on who the other speed horses are. And this isn't a race that we have coded in red, but I do think there's some real speed in here. And I wouldn't be surprised if we had a red fraction or two in this race.
Yeah, especially with Sassy Nature in here. I agree. I cannot see her getting 7 furlongs. Just watching her races, to me, she is pure sprinter. She has a little bit of an inefficient stride, I guess I would put it. I mean, she's just all muscle and mass to her, and she just, to me, everything about her says the more ground, the worse it is for her. So I don't see this being the right spot for her. I guess if I was going to highlight one other horse that I could maybe upgrade a little bit, Craig, it would be the number 3 Intrepid Daydream. And watching back that Sugar Swirl, she had no real excuse. I mean, she just chased the winner around the track. But she is second off the trainer switch to Safi Joseph, and her form has been steadily heading in the right direction lately. She's got at least one big speed figure from the past that puts her in the mix here, can get 7 furlongs. So she's kind of one of the few horses I can project a little bit of upside for, but she's another one who's going to be in that chasing position. And I think a lot of horses are going to try to be getting that kind of tracking trip in here. So we'll see how that all plays out. At the end of the day, I just trusted the number 9, Mary Quite Contrary, the most. Let's move on to race 10. It is over to the turf course for the Pegasus World Cup Filly and Mare Turf Invitational. A mouthful, that is. Mile and a 16th on the turf course for these fillies and mares. And I think the conversation with this race, Craig, has to start with the number 4 Star Fortress and what we're supposed to do with her in this race. We talked about it when she ran on the Pacecast that week. I mean, what do you make of a horse like this? First start in the country for Cherie DeVaux, wins off by 10 lengths at Churchill, beats some decent horses, probably not nearly as good a field as she's meeting here, but she beat them by 10 lengths, so who cares what was behind her? I mean, she got a 127 Timeform US speed figure. I mean, you can correct me if I'm wrong. I believe that was one of the only, if not the only, turf race that day, so probably hard to have a lot of confidence in the number, but visually impressive. I mean, she performed like she could be a potential star in this division, but at some point you got to see her do it against tougher horses.
For sure. I don't know how I mean, there are some good horses in here, so I don't want to knock it. I believe that was the only turf race that day. It's proven to be a decent race. The third place finisher came right back to win, running a very similar speed figure, Lovely Princess, to what she always does, a 115. So it's really tricky for me. The course was just so different. We only had it rated as a 5 on the Timeform US track condition scale or track speed rating. I don't remember the exact name of it. So I think it's a really tough call with her. And honestly, I just haven't made up my mind yet. I wish we would know the odds. I don't have the morning line odds as we're talking about this one, but it just is a tough call because there are some other horses in here who can really run. And could give her a run for her money. So I think you have to make a decision about her. And I haven't really decided yet. If I think she's going to run her race that we saw last time, I could happily single her and move on in what's a really tough sequence. If you don't, and you're very skeptical, which I totally understand, then I think there's probably some different directions you could go. Maybe 3 or 4 different horses I'd consider using in here.
I did get the morning line of this race from social media, for what it's worth. I personally don't agree with a few of the lines on horses in this race, so I'm not gonna reference it too much. But she was installed as the 5-2 morning line favorite, and I get it. I mean, she's got to take some money off that kind of speed figure, that visually impressive victory from last time. But Craig, here's my take on that race, and you can tell me if you think this is valid. Um, that turf course at Churchill, it was rated good, as you said, track condition rating 5, definitely had give to it. Hard to really peg it down, just given the lack of use of that turf course at that time. But I think just considering that, it seemed like a turf course some horses were not handling. I think that's fair to say. So I don't know how much I care that horses ran back to the number or improved out of the race among those that finished behind her. Because when you watch the replay, so much of that 10-length margin of victory was just the other horses stopping. I mean, it's not like she ran her final eighth in 10 seconds. I mean, she was just grinding along at the same pace that had been running, and everybody else just basically came to a walk at the end of that race. And you can see it on the TimeformUS pace figure line. It was a pretty fast pace, and she was the only one that could sustain it. And so I say to myself, okay, this horse has some stamina. And then I look back at her European races, and over there, she was campaigned exclusively between 1.25 miles and 1.5 miles. And I wonder if that victory going 1.125 miles over a turf course that was somewhat demanding was indicative of a horse that won a race through stamina and not through sheer finishing speed. And I'm wondering if maybe she would have been a better fit in a race like the La Prevoyante earlier in the card, going 1.5 miles, than turning back to 1.16 miles in this race. Based on the last race, I don't know if she has that turn of foot speed to win a race like this. And maybe I'm reading too much into her competing over that messed up Churchill course last time. But at what I expect is going to be a short price, that's a big outstanding question for me. And it's enough for me to want to downgrade her a bit in this spot.
Yeah, I've got no issue with that. And the more you talked as you were going through it, this is never the kind of horse I want to take a short price. And 5-2 might even be a little bit of a pipe dream as the morning line favorite off that win. She'd probably even go lower than that. And she had some real competition in here. So I'll just mention a few that I would consider using to beat her. I think the most obvious one is probably Fluffy Socks for Chad Brown. She's a mare who just seems to run a race almost every single time out, always running speed figures in the 120s on TimeformUS. Just always shows up and gives her best race. Didia is another one who comes out of the Breeders' Cup Filly and Mare Turf, but she didn't run very well that day. She was beaten 4.5 lengths from an outside post. Didn't really have much of a shot in there, but she always runs 120 type TimeformUS speed figures. So it's a little bit different. It's not like the horse with the big figure, whose name has now just escaped me, Star Fortress, has a huge gap on speed figures over the rest of this field. There's plenty of other quality in here. So I'm willing to give those two a chance. They would probably be my A's. Queen Goddess in here, I think, has a shot. She comes out of the Matriarch where she didn't run very well, but it was her second start off a layoff, maybe regress. She's a defending champion in this race, albeit it wasn't nearly as strong a race last year, I don't think, but she's a horse who's been good all year. So I think the more I talked about it, this is a race I want to spread and probably try to beat Star Fortress.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just take a few of those that you mentioned and talk my way through them. I kind of agree with one of the points that you were getting at, Craig, is that it's not like Star Fortress has that big of a speed figure advantage on that field. And that speed figure, it's a little suspect over a very different course. And Didia in particular, she's got a slew of speed figures that make her pretty close to as fast as that potential favorite. Now, look, Didia 6-1 in the morning line. This is the one I just don't get at all. I mean, I think she's going to vie for favoritism in this race, and she probably should. I mean, yeah, she didn't really have much of a shot in the Breeders' Cup last time, but she still was bet down to only 9-1 in that race against the likes of Inspiral and Warm Heart. I mean, she had some support in there because her resume in 2023 was awesome coming into that. I mean, her lone loss when she got wired by market segmentation in that New York, but finished ahead of some good horses that day, like McCulloch and Warlike Goddess, and then beat Anisette in the Rodeo Drive. Not that Anisette is, one of the best horses in this division, but she's one of the best they have out west, and Didia easily handled her. I just think she makes a lot of sense in here. Mile on the 16th is not a problem for her. So I kind of view her as the horse to beat. As for Fluffy Socks, and I guess we can mention the Chad Brown runners in here in general, because he's got a couple of them. I mean, I do like her much more than Chili Flag. And she's fine. She doesn't get the job done as much as I would like. And I thought her trip in the Matriarch at the end of the day, it worked out pretty well. There was pace in there. She got out with plenty of time, and just surge capacity got a slightly better trip than she did, saving more ground and coming through along the inside. So I think that she makes sense based on that recent form. I just don't totally trust her to seal the deal. She's more of a horse that I would feel confident using with another horse that I think adds some value to this race rather than keying on her. So she's in the mix for me, but she's not necessarily a top pick. And speaking of the Matriarch, Craig, when I went back and watched that race, the horse that I kind of didn't realize how well she ran that day was Ruby Nell, the 6th. I mean, she got the wrong trip for her, was out of position early, was legitimately 4 to 5 wide around the far turn, just impossible to win from that position. And she still stayed on pretty well at the end to only be beaten 2 lengths by horses who got much better trips than she did. Now, surrounding that are 2 races in California where she just ran off on the lead and dominated the competition. Included among those was a victory over Anisette 3 back in the Autumn Miss, where she soundly defeated that classy rival. The big question with Ruby Nell is if she goes back to those free running tactics on the front end, which I think is likely in this race. I know there's some other potential speed from a horse like Accomplished Girl or Sister Luann. Saffy Joseph trains both of them, so he's probably going to decide to have one of them send. But I mean, Ruby Nell, if she goes, she's the fastest of them all early, I think. The big question is, can she get a mile on the 16th running that way? I don't know, but I think she might be a little better than she's been given credit for as a California shipper.
Yeah, I've got no issue with her, particularly on the Gulfstream course. Speed is never a bad thing. And I could easily see her wiring this field. Hopefully that's the tactics they would use. The only other horse I really wanted to mention was Cairo Consort. She was a little bit interesting to me. I wanted to ask you about the replay of that last race because I was trying to watch it. I was having some technical issues. I actually didn't think her comeback race was bad. She's a newly turned 4-year-old. We didn't see her since May. It definitely feels like that was a prep race to me. She gets Ryan Moore in the saddle from the rail position, a very good post. And if a horse like Ruby Nell goes out there and sets a fast pace, I could easily see her getting a perfect trip inside. What I wanted to ask about was it says she was off the pace inside, then 7 wide. I was just wondering what you thought of her trip that day.
Well, you just have to look at who was riding her, Craig. Irad Ortiz. He does make that move from the rail to the 7th path, and that's actually fairly accurate. I mean, she really angled out pretty severely at the top of the stretch. Didn't interfere with anybody, but I mean, she altered course all the way to the far outside, and she had a clear run at it through the stretch. She was coming at the end. I don't think she did anything remarkable that day. She was just sort of running along at one pace with the other closers. Craig, I love our TimeformUS speed figures, and I think that you do the best job that you could possibly do with a lot of these tough races, and I believe your assistant does Gulfstream. I can only imagine how difficult it is to make speed figures on these days when they're only running 2 or 3 or 4 turf races on a 11 or 12 race card surrounded by turf and synthetic races. It's just tough to have confidence. I have some trouble with the speed figure for that Tropical Park Oaks. To me, it just feels high for everybody in the race. And I know it compares favorably to another stakes on the card, and that's why it's high. But to me, too many horses are shown improving in that race for me to buy that number. So I don't like Cairo Consort kind of more based on that as opposed to the trip last time. And Todd Pletcher actually has a couple of horses that are bookending the field in here. And I'm way more interested in the number 12, surprisingly, who Mike Rapoli bought for $1 million at Keeneland November last year. Understandably, she's a Phipps homebred broodmare prospect, so she's got all that residual value to eventually go to the breeding shed one day. But he's going to race her on for at least another season, and she was moving in the right direction for Shug last year. she was not as good as her main rival, Consumer Spending, who I think beat her 3 times in her last 3 races. And Consumer Spending probably should have won that Boston Spa the last time, when surprisingly was just kind of one pace at the end. But I do think there's the potential for this pace to heat up a little bit. And a lot of the horses that we're talking about kind of run in mid pack. And then there's Fluffy Socks, who makes a big late run, doesn't often get there. And I'm looking for maybe another closer to make a big run. And she's the kind of horse that I could see Oisin Murphy just taking to the back of the pack, trying to get lucky if the pace comes apart. And she's going to be a big price in here. So I don't think that she's got to improve that much off her speed figures from the 4-year-old season to be a factor in this race. So she's another one that I want to include somewhere.
Yeah, she actually lost to Consumer Spending 4 times in a row. If you go back to when
That's true.
the Bogey. Yeah, I got no issue with her. My only problem was the 12 post, which at this mile and the 16th distance certainly isn't ideal. The rider, he's from overseas, Murphy, as you noted. He's been riding great, though. If anybody can work out a trip from there, it could be him.
Let's move on to race 11, back to the dirt. It is the grade 3 Fred Hooper going the 1-turn mile distance for the older runners. And seems like a pretty wide open race, Craig. We've got a Bob Baffert shipper in here, and the number 1 Hijazi. And maybe that's a good place to start, because it seems like Bob is usually serious when he ships a horse like this over for a big day. Obviously, he's just coming along with National Treasure, who's the main horse in the big race. But Hijazi is a good horse in his own right. Arguably, he's been mildly disappointing to have not achieved a stakes victory yet, because there's been a lot of hype around him. I mean, he was that $3.5 million 2-year-old once upon a time. But he did run fairly well in the Malibu in his most recent start behind Speedboat Beach, who's got to be considered one of the best 3-year-old sprinter milers out there right now. That race was kind of dominated on the front end by Bob Baffert. They were able to just control it over a track that might have been somewhat speed favoring. Now he's drawn the rail with another fast horse right to his outside, an Expressman. So I worry about his trip more than I worry about his ability.
I do. I'm going to try to beat him in here. I am saying I agree with you. His speed figures don't tower over this field. I thought, even though it was a stablemate, he pretty much had everything his own way and was no match at all for Speedboat Beach. And I don't like the trip he projects to get in here, particularly out of that chute going the mile distance. So I'm looking at a couple horses to the outside that I like a little more. I like Gilmore a little bit, second off the layoff. He won't be my top pick in here, but I like him stretching out a little bit more. He was very good as a 3-year-old. They probably tried to go way too far with him at Parks in the Derby, but his comeback was okay. I don't want to dismiss him. The horse I would consider making my top pick is Accretive, the 8 horse who comes out of the Cigar Mile. He was a horse who was moving in the right direction for Chad Brown. Had really no chance that day. It was a very speed favoring inside track. He was wide all the way around. Really did no running. But when you look at his speed figure, it wasn't all that bad, as Hoist the Gold just kind of ran away from the field, ran a big number. So I think he's got a real shot in here. I think the mile is perfect for him, and looking for a big race from him. And the other one I wanted to talk about was Tumba Roomba, the 11 horse in here, who's coming out of a Louisiana bred race. And maybe some people would kind of turn their nose up at that as he moves into open company. But this horse is good. The horse he lost to, Touch Upon a Star, is just absolutely dominates the Louisiana bred older male division. He's a horse who shipped out to Lone Star to run in the Texas Mile there, I think it's called these days. No, the Sexton Mile. Ran a very good race that day, narrowly losing. And when you look back at his Oklahoma Derby, where he was only beat a head that day, he's a horse that's actually been a pretty key race. There has been a lot of horses to come back and win from that race. So I've got no problems with the speed figure that day. He's a 4-year-old, and I'm actually really interested in him. So the A's for me would be the 8 and the 11.
Yeah, Tumba Rumba is the horse with the erroneous chart call that I was referencing earlier. If you're looking at that Oklahoma Derby line and you think it's weird that he went from 4th to 9th to 3rd in the stretch, He did not. He was battling for the lead for the entire stretch drive. That's just a mistake in the chart that maybe will never be corrected. Who knows? Sometimes those never get fixed. Once upon a time, I reported a race at Belmont, I think it was, that actually the finishing order was wrong for like horses that were 6th and 7th, and it's still wrong today. Sometimes that stuff just gets overlooked. But as for Tumbarumba, I agree with what you're saying, Craig. The horse that he was beaten by last time, Touch Upon a Star. I don't know why the connections don't try to run him in some tougher spots, because that horse is really good, mostly competing against Louisiana breds. I did notice looking through his prepes, he's never run at a track that complies with HISA. Maybe that's got something to do with it. But Tumbarumba ran really well and gave that horse all he could handle last time. The Oklahoma Derby, like you said, it was a fine effort, and he's run okay going one turn in the past, so I don't really mind the turn back for him that much. And what I really like is that as a horse who could get a little outrun early compared to some of his recent races, at least he's drawn outside, so the kickback probably isn't going to be too much of an issue for him. So I think he's viable. As for some of the others that you mentioned, Creative was against it last time in the Cigar Mile. He was against it right from the start because he broke about a length slowly, and that put him out of position. And then he was on the wide chase, which you just could not do. My problem with Accretive is when you got horses like him that were compromised by a trip, what I do is I cross out that race and I say, okay, would I like this horse if that race wasn't showing? And my answer with him is I'm on the fence. His prior form is okay. I thought he probably should have won the 49 or two back. And he was kind of second to Cody's Wish by default. I don't want to upgrade him too much for that performance because he was setting a very soft pace that day. But he's Chad Brown and Irad Ortiz. I just wonder if he's going to be the kind of price I need on him. I'd probably need like 8-1. And I don't think I'm going to get that price on Accretive. So I was leaning towards downgrading him a little bit. I think you will get a better price on Gilmore. I'm okay with upgrading a horse like that, Craig. I know he looks probably a cut below these on form, recent form at the very least, but he's got that huge effort in the Woody Stevens from last year that hasn't necessarily stood the test of time, but it seems like at least the Mr. Prospector last time first start off the layoff. It's a step in the right direction. I thought he was staying on well at the end of that race, and he actually galloped out past the winner, Sibelius. So I think stretching back out to the mile is going to suit him. So I like him from that standpoint. I do want to get your take on a horse that I think could also take some money in this race, and one that I'm being a bit more charitable towards than Accretive, and that's the number 12 Signator, who is a horse that I know a lot of people have had high hopes for a long time. He's another very expensive 2-year-old purchase. I think he and Hijazi were two of the most expensive 2-year-old purchases of 2022, and they're in the same race now. Signator did have an excuse last time in the Queens County. He blew the start, was off slowly, gave up ground right from the beginning, and he did make a big wide run to get there in mid-stretch, and then just couldn't quite finish it off at the very end. I don't mind him turning back to the mile because I think at the very least, even if he drops way back, he's going to get pace in this race. And he's the kind of horse that wants to make that big sweeping run around the field. So I think that things could work out for him in here. He's a popular horse, and I wouldn't want to take too short a price on him.
Yeah, that's the only issue I have. I don't know what price he's going to be. And like I said, I'm not sure how much the morning line would really tell us, but he's certainly moving in the right direction. Speed figure wise, he's gotten better almost every single time that he comes out, including last time in defeat. My other concern with him is, other than the price, is I thought maybe he's a horse who could get lost in here, because even going a mile and an eighth with races with blue fractions, he just kind of dropped out of it in small fields. And granted, he was able to make a big run, and I think he'll be making a big run here. I just wonder how much he's going to leave himself to do.
You know, Craig, if I had to make a top pick in this race, I love to get a little creative in these spots. And I think the horse that I would anticipate will offer the best value, and I admit I haven't seen the morning line for this race yet. I only have, I don't have the strongest feelings about how it's going to get bet. I've thought about it a little bit, but I think a horse that I like that is going to be a fair price in here is the number 3, Steel Sunshine. And I know that he's maybe a cut below the mark he needs to hit in terms of speed figures. He's kind of right at that 115, 116 range, and that's been his ceiling. But I like his last couple of races. I mean, he almost always runs well in one-turn races at Gulfstream. He seems to really love that configuration. We saw it two back when he beat overmatched competition very handily. And then last time in the Harlan's Holiday, we're going to talk about some horses that we may or may not like out of that Harlan's Holiday, but in the Pegasus World Cup a little bit later. But I mean, that's generally considered by most handicappers to be a legitimate prep race this year for the Pegasus. And I thought he ran as well as anybody in that race. He didn't have great position early, had to go really wide coming off the far turn to make his run. And he was really finishing at the end that day, going the 2-turn mile in the 16th. Now he's cutting back a little bit. Paco Lopez has that ride aboard him. And I think he fits this horse pretty well because last time, I at least like that he kept him a little bit closer to the pace than he's been in some starts prior where he would drop a little too far behind. I don't feel like he's doing that as much lately. He's going out for a barn that's been doing pretty well recently at Gulfstream. And I just think he could be a very fair price in this race, could fly under the radar as some horses that we already mentioned take a lot more money or have that sexy look to them where they've got more obvious upside. And I just envision this horse getting the right trip in this race.
Yeah, he definitely did not get the right trip last time. It's a short run to the first turn in those mile and a 16th races at Gulfstream. He was wide around that turn. It's a race where they use an alternate finish line, if I remember right, and doesn't give you much of a stretch run. And I thought he ran fine. And like you said, his speed figures, I mean, maybe they're a cut below the race rating for this race in TimeformUS is a 120. He's been running in the mid-teens, 114, 115, 116. So it's not much of a leap to think that he's going to get a nice trip in here and come running late. We really haven't talked much about the pace projector. We mentioned Hijazi and Expressman, the two inside horses. We do have this labeled as a fast-paced race, and I don't disagree with that at all. I think it is a race where you probably want to look for horses that are going to be running a little later.
Yeah, and Expressman is part of that pace. I think he's the biggest thorn in the side for Hijazi. I personally don't trust him to get back to that impressive debut performance at Saratoga. That race just seems to live on an island somewhere. And he's run okay since then, but hasn't really lived up to the potential. And one other horse that we might want to mention, Craig, before moving on is the number 7, Castle Chaos. I mean, if you're going to like Accretive a little bit, aren't you supposed to give this horse a look? He was also wide against the bias in the Cigar Mile. That's assuming he doesn't get into the Pegasus World Cup, which as of the time of recording this, I think he's still, one deep on the also eligible list. I haven't seen anybody come out of that race. And this is probably a better spot for that horse. I kind of want to see it again from him personally at this level.
Yeah, I mean, he's a 6-year-old. He's never really run fast enough, though he has been improving of late. I could see the case for him, but he's not really for me. I did want to mention one other horse, and that's Giant Game, because when you look at his PPs, he certainly has the speed figures in his last 6 races. 3 of them are 120 or above, but he's as much as any seems like a horse that needs things his own way on the front end. And when he doesn't get it, he pretty readily kicks it in, packs it in. And I think that's going to be the case here. So it's one of those cases where even though he has the numbers to match up and maybe even win this race, I just don't see the trip working out.
Yeah, I agree with that. On speed figures, he looks okay, but the trip seems tough to come for him. Really, both Dale Roman's trainees in this race who've got some speed and just feel like they're going to get outrun in the early stages. Let's move on to the 12th race. Back over to the turf course. It is the Pegasus World Cup Turf, and mile and an eighth is the distance for these older runners. And Craig, we did our stakes preview of this one, and I think this is the race where we agreed a little bit more, mostly on our take on Warm Heart, who is the morning line favorite in here. We'll see how short she really goes off. I mean, she's 9-5 on the line. I guess that's a reasonable price on her. Her Breeders' Cup filly and mare turf, it was good. She got an awesome trip and ride from Ryan Moore that day, who took full advantage of her inside post position, saved every inch of ground, found the split at the perfect time in the stretch, got her on through, and she was simply run down by a better horse in Inspiral. Now, Inspiral would probably be 4-5 on this race because she is just that good. But Warm Heart is a horse who had been coming into very good form over the summer in Europe. She was really kind of reaching her peak when she got to that Prix Vermeil at Longchamp in September, was a game winner of that race and carried that form forward to the Breeders' Cup. And I think it's fair to ask if that loss in the Hong Kong Vase last time is maybe a sign that she's starting to descend on the other end of the hill. And this is supposed to be the last race of her career. I think she's supposed to be bred this year, and I think they're just squeezing in one more start with her. So you wonder if this race is a little bit of an afterthought for her. And also, you got to take into consideration the distance. She's mostly been at her best going a mile and a quarter out to a mile and a half. And here she's cutting back to 9 furlongs, and that just could be a little sharp for her.
I agree. And I mean, this is a strong field, and I just don't want a short price on her. And I mean, one thing you didn't mention, for a couple things I wanted to touch on. One, it's Gulfstream Park. I mean, it couldn't be much different than what she runs on over in Europe. Now, granted, she transferred her form to Santa Anita. That was at a longer distance. Santa Anita, I think, is a little more friendly to the European style of racing. And the other is just the massive amount of travel that she's had to endure. I mean, she's went from Longchamp to Santa Anita, back to Hong Kong. Now she's flying back all the way to Florida. I mean, that's a lot to ask for a newly turned 4-year-old filly. And I don't like that they're just trying to get in one more race before sending her off to the breeding shed. I mean, I fully understand she's the best horse on paper, but they don't race races on paper. And at a short price, I'm just going to try to beat this filly.
Yeah, and I think the obvious direction to go if you're trying to beat her is the number 3 Integration, and seems legitimate to me, Craig. 3 starts so far. They've all been visually impressive. He beat a really good horse, too, back in Program Trading at Colonial. I mean, I think in retrospect, it looks even better because Program Trading has come back out of that race and he won the Hollywood Derby, beating another horse that we're going to talk about in here, Web Slinger. I mean, it's not nothing that he was able to run that horse down, even though it was at his home track, Colonial, during the summer. But I mean, he put some distance between himself and Program Trading at the end of that race. And, that turn of foot that we saw from him on that occasion, it was arguably even more enhanced last time at Aqueduct when he was sitting a little closer to the pace. And not a slow pace by any means. And he made that move to be in position to take it over at the quarter pole. And I mean, he got to the front, and then the way that the turnover on his stride just quickened through the final eighth of a mile, it was really something to behold. And, you look at the raw times of that race and you almost don't want to believe them, to go from a mile and 1:36.1 to have a 1:47 flat final time. And I didn't quite believe it at the time, but they use the teletimer system to time these races and the fractions in New York. I went to go check the raw GMAX fractions to make sure that they matched. And they did. GMAX had him coming home his last 3/16 of a mile in 5.44 for a 16th, 5.43, and 5.44. I know that the turf course was firm and playing relatively fast, but I mean, I look at a lot of incremental fractions for Craig, and I can't recall too many horses putting together, 3 consecutive sub 5.5 splits at the end of a race like this horse did. I mean, he's really good. He drew a post position towards the inside. Some might not like the connections are making this rider switch back to Tyler Gaffalione because Kendrick Carmouche rode him so well. And I honestly, if you ask me, I think Kendrick Carmouche should have 2 mounts on this card in the final 2 races because he's ridden 2 horses in these last couple of races really well. But I mean, that's tough for Kendrick. But I mean, the connections clearly are taking this race very seriously, and they want to have a rider that they feel can deliver the right ride. And I just think this horse is going to show up. And if he shows up, I anticipate nobody's going to beat him in this spot.
Yeah, I can see that. I didn't make him my top pick, but he would certainly be an A for me. You mentioned when he beat Program Trading at Colonial. When you look through that race, he didn't just beat him. He beat some other really good horses too. He beat Runaway Storm, who went on from that race to win the Bryan Station, beating a good field. Gigante is in there, who's won 2 races since. One was an off the turf race, but he had a big win. I think it was at the fairgrounds right at the end of the year. So that was a really strong field. I don't think the field was nearly as strong last time, but it didn't matter. He was that impressive. The way he closed that race and just really opened up in the stretch. And that was over a firm turf course. It wasn't one like we were talking about earlier where maybe other horses just weren't handling it. He was just pulling away from the rest of them. So I've got no issue with him whatsoever. And depending on the price, I mean, I could easily find myself betting him if they go overboard on the filly in here.
Yeah, Craig, if I could jump in for a sec. I mean, I guess it's more a question that I would be inclined to answer than you, but I mean, because making lines is my job. But I mean, do you have a sense for that? I mean, do you think there's a chance that integration goes favored in here? Because I mean, this horse does have a following. I mean, he's got that visually impressive win, and I, I get the sense that we're not the only ones that are skeptical of Warm Heart. I mean, do you think there's a chance that this line actually gets flipped and he's the favorite?
I think it'll be very close. I mean, I think it could go either way. I don't think it's a given that Warm Heart is going to be the favorite. What is the line on integration? 3-1, I
Three to
think it is.
one, yeah.
Yeah, I could see them both being somewhere around 2-1, 5-2, and maybe it could be flipped. It's just one as an in race or a guy who's just going to bet this race and maybe vertically. I'm glad I can wait. But when it comes to pick fives, I much prefer this one, so I don't really have to decide.
Yeah, I mean, I just get the sense, Craig, assessing integration, that this horse might be pretty special. And typically I would be reticent to use that language because typically we're using that language about horses that are going to be 1-5. I mean, typically they're so exposed and they're running in spots where we already know that the public is expecting something great. But I feel like this is one step before integration gets to that point. And even if he's 2-1, 9-5, 8-5. He's the kind of horse that I would still, at that kind of price, given what I think he could be, I'd be okay leaning on him in a multi-race sequence at that kind of price. I know you want to get a little more creative in here, so I'll throw it back to you.
Yeah, and it's just another horse I would be interested in using just because I think he's going to be a huge price and he runs good speed figures. I like his draw when he fits in here, and that's Web Slinger. Maybe he'll let me down again. Maybe he's just a horse who has to be on the outside to run his best race, and if that's the case, he's in trouble. But if he could get a good inside trip and somehow work it out and get free in the stretch, he really runs in the stretch. The issue is he rarely gets it done, particularly since he's moved up in company, trying grade ones. He's also trying older horses for the first time. So it's not like I love him. I think integration is a much more likely winner, but I do think he's going to fall through the cracks and be a huge price. So I will be using him in my vertical plays for sure. And I would use him as in the pick five also, just probably more as maybe a more lukewarm A or a B type, but I think he's going to run better than what some people believe. I know there's a couple other, at least one other that we both had in our top four. I'll swing it back to you for him.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just respond to Web Slinger because I was, when I was first handicapping this race, I was strongly considering picking him as well. But the more I thought about it, I was, and as I developed my opinion about integration, I just feel like Web Slinger needs integration to find trouble to win this race. And he needs the trip himself. And for the Web Slinger, that's been a big issue. I mean, maybe he's finally due for it. But I feel like he's not as good. So the price is going to be there. And there's always chances in these large fields that horses can find trouble. For me, I couldn't quite get there, but I really do understand the case for Web Slinger. And the other horse that I think you were alluding to that we agree on is the number 2, Jerry the Nipper. Am I viewing him as a likely winner of this race? No, because he's Jerry the Nipper. I mean, he's a really good New York bred and he runs some competitive speed figures, but do I really think he's supposed to win the Pegasus World Cup Turf? Probably not. Realizing that right inside of him is a Tone who won this race last year, but that was a weaker edition of this race, I think it's fair to say. But I mean, as for Jerry the Nipper, he's just gotten a series of trips that I'll quote my friend Andy Serling, who said it's amazing Jose Ortiz is still riding this horse, and I can concur with that. I mean, because some questionable decisions have been made with Jerry the Nipper. I mean, the fact they took away his speed that he once possessed, rating him behind a slow pace 3 back, again 2 back, and then taking that weird stumble at the top of the stretch. I don't know what was going on, but he probably should have won that race. And then last time out, for anybody that is a believer in that Jose Irad conspiracy theory that they help each other, watch the backstretch run of that Fort Lauderdale from the head-on perspective, where Irad basically forces his way from the 3 path into the 2 path, and where there was previously a path for Jerry the Nipper, suddenly there was none. He got shuffled back in all of that, while Irad's horse he knew he had no horse, and he just went backwards. Jerry the Nipper should have won that race too. They're putting blinkers on here, Craig, and I have I'm afraid to have hope, but I wonder if maybe they're finally going to get back to those more aggressive tactics and send him forward in this race.
Yeah, I don't think they have a lot of choice from that inside post. If they don't, he's probably just going to get shuffled back and have way too much to do. He's not a horse I would say has this gigantic finishing kick that could make it up, but he's a horse I'm very interested in verticals because I almost feel like Jose Ortiz is just due to give him a good ride, even if it's by accident. It seems like with this inside draw, there is some speed. He should get a good trip, and I think he might be overlooked. I won't be surprised if this horse is 15 or 20 to 1 off of all those bad trips in a row. And I'm with you. It's hard for me to see him beating horses like Integration and Warm Heart if she shows up, but I could see him being in the vertical place.
Yeah, I don't think he's going to be 20 to 1. I know on the line, he's the biggest price of the horses coming out of the Fort Lauderdale. I think he's going to be the shortest price of the horses coming out of the Fort Lauderdale because I think a lot of people realize he's the most interesting horse out of that race. But I mean, given how much money the two favorites are going to take, he's probably going to be at least 10 to 1 in this race. And I'm viewing him more as a horse to use underneath in exotics. If I'm playing exactas, I've got 3 2s. I've got 3 with other horses with 2. That's more how I'm viewing Jerry the Nipper in this race. And maybe on a pick 5, he's like a C for me. But I really want most of my play to go through Integration in here. And Craig, I don't have a whole lot else to say about this race. I know we only talked about a handful of contenders, but I feel like in this one, contention doesn't run nearly as deep as in the next race we're going to talk about.
No, I agree with that. It's not a race I would spread very much in.
Well, let's move on to the main event on this card at Gulfstream, the 13th race, the final leg of this pick 5 sequence. It is the Pegasus World Cup, $3 million on the line for these older runners going a mile and an eighth on the dirt. And Craig, I really enjoyed when we sent our picks into our videos this morning that we had 8 numbers in total, 4 completely different sets of horses. And I just think that's perfect for this race because it's the kind of race that it is. I mean, 5 different people can look at this race and come up with, 5 completely different opinions. It's just so wide open. The favorites are not so formidable looking that you can't start to get very creative. And, I probably you could say I started to get very creative in this race, and we'll get to some of my opinions in this one. But it really was a fun race to handicap. I spent a lot of time on it, and you could really go down the rabbit hole here. I think just to create some order for our discussion, we should probably just start with those favorites that I think you have to develop an opinion about to play this race and maybe take it to the next step and trying to find some value. National Treasure and First Mission. First of all, just from a line standpoint, I think these two are going to vie for favoritism. I don't think National Treasure is going to be 9 to 5. I don't think anybody's going to be 9 to 5 in this race. It's just way too competitive. My inclination is that they're probably both going to be around 3 to 1, 5 to 2, 3 to 1. Actually, if you look on DRF.com, I put out my expected line for this race as part of a fair value odds piece that I did, just kind of looking for value in this race. And I had to go through that process to handicap this race because I think for especially a race like this, where maybe you don't have a strong opinion and you're just trying to sift through a lot of horses that look the same, making a fair value line can really just restore some clarity to the handicapping process. So I did that. And going through these two horses, National Treasure and First Mission, personally for me, Craig, I was leaning more towards National Treasure, just kind of trusting that Bob Baffert, when he sends a horse to a big race like this, that's the horse in his barn that is really up to the challenge. Bob doesn't ship that often, and typically when he does, these horses run fairly well. That was not the case for National Treasure in the Travers, obviously, and I think you could hold that against this horse. But since then, it feels like they figured out that this horse needs a much more aggressive ride. He was successful in the Preakness. He was successful, or nearly getting the job done last time in the Breeders' Cup Dirt Mile, getting sent. And I think they're going to try to use those tactics again. And I would be very concerned about the presence of Hoist the Gold in this race if he were not drawn outside of that foe like he is. I think those two are the ones that are going to be up front heading into the clubhouse turn. And I just kind of feel, watching National Treasure's workouts coming into this race, like this horse is sitting on a big performance. I don't love him by any means. He's not the kind of horse I'm itching to bet at even 5 to 2 or 3 to 1. But I just feel like he's probably going to show up and run pretty well.
Yeah, his race was very good in the Breeders' Cup Dirt Mile. It kind of came out of nowhere, but I guess not if you consider that he's a horse who's done all his best racing on the lead, and he was kind of taken out of that style, as you alluded to a couple of times, for some unknown reason. It was puzzling at the time. It was even more puzzling when they did it again in the Awesome Again, but he showed up in that dirt mile and ran well and was kind of unlucky to lose. He easily could have won that race. My issue with him, and it's not a big issue because, like you, I think he's going to run well, but it kind of goes to the pace projector where Timeform US has this as a race with a fast pace. Now, he's shown back in fourth or fifth. I don't really agree with that. It has to do with how he was ridden a couple times. I think he'll be up more forward than that. But I do think there's some real speed in here, and it starts with Hoist the Gold, who you mentioned, coming out of the Cigar Mile. I'm very skeptical he'll be able to repeat a race like that over a more fair racetrack, but there's no doubt that he's fast. He's trying to get a mile and an eighth for a first time, and I think he's clearly going to be up there on the front end. Maybe National Treasure presses him, maybe not, but I also think there's some other speed in here as well. I mean, First Mission comes out of that Clark where he ran a good second. His ham was kind of forced that day. He drew inside in that field. He's done a little bit better for when he raced slightly off the pace, but he was also in a lot of easier races in those spots. So I'm not sure how he's going to be ridden here, but he's a horse who could easily be forcing the pace. Grand Aspen is a horse who's always right there. So I kind of looked at this race through the prism that the pace is going to be fast, even if I don't really agree with how the pace projector has them lined up early. I do think it's a race when you run for this kind of money. It's very rare for horses to be able to steal things on the front end. So whoever's on the front end, if they're going to win, they're going to have to earn it. So with National Treasure being the morning line favorite and one, maybe you agree, maybe you disagree. I was kind of looking that he's up against it a little bit. Even if he runs a good race, I'm interested in taking him on at a short price.
You know, Craig, I totally agree with everything you're saying about how this race is going to shape up on the front end. And, we're on the same page about National Treasure being a little more forward than he's shown on the pace projector. As part of my handicapping process for this race, I went back and I watched every Pegasus World Cup. And I'm differentiating it a little from the Don handicap, even though it's the same race. And the people who say that this is a different race than the Don was, I think are being a little silly. I mean, you go back and look at some editions of the Don handicap, and it attracted many of the stars of the level that the Pegasus had. But the difference is, since they put up the big money for this race, it's drawn a full field almost every year. And we haven't seen too many examples of them running full fields going 9 furlongs at Gulfstream. It's a pretty rare occurrence. And the thing that I noticed watching the prior editions of the Pegasus was how well speed did. Even when it seemed like there was a lot of speed in the race, the paces just seemed to hold together. Now, some of that is that it's generally over the years been a pretty chalky race. And a lot of the horses that have dominated towards the front end, like the Life is Goods and the Nix Goes and the City of Lights, I mean, there were horses that were supposed to win, but a few of them have been more merry-go-round races. And I think especially back to last year's Pegasus, where I was viewing it as more of a race that was going to come apart. And a horse like Art Collector, who was in the teeth of the pace every step of the way, was able to win, and the pace mostly held together. And at a track like Gulfstream, where it can be pretty tough to make those big runs from far back, I worry a little bit about getting too excited about closers in a race like this. And a horse like National Treasure, who I do anticipate is going to be probably in the clear, out of kickback every step of the way, if he's ridden like the way we think he is, and in the race for the entirety of it, I expect him to find enough to still be part of the finish at the end. So that's why I'm not too against him, just kind of viewing this race through the lens of how it's been run in the past. But do I think he's a great bet at 3-1, like I was saying? No. So let's move on to First Mission, because we spent a lot of time on National Treasure. What's your take on First Mission, Craig? Because I know you like this horse a little more than I do, and more of the two favorites.
Yeah, I will say first off, I'm a little bit skeptical of that Timeform US speed figure out of that race. I mean, it made sense on the day. When you look at the chart, The top two ran much bigger than they had run in the past. Everybody else, it kind of lines up. The run backs have been, I would say, underwhelming to this point. There's been 3 or 4 of them, and nobody's really ran back to that race. But even if the race is 7 or 8 points slower, it's not like that makes a horse like First Mission impossible in here, because, it's not the strongest race that we've seen for a Pegasus, as we've talked about before. And I think his hand was a little bit forced that they draw an inside. I like that he draws a little bit more to the outside in here. I'm kind of torn on him. The real negative is I think he's probably going to be over bet based off of that race, but I don't think he's without chance. And I think he'll do a little bit better in a more stalking position.
Yeah, I mean, my problem with First Mission is he's been a short price every time. He's a horse that people have high expectations for. And from my vantage point, he hasn't yet proved it. I think he was supposed to win last time. Yes, he got some pressure, and the pace was legitimate that day. It was fairly honest. But it's not like it was a race where the pace fell apart by any means. It mostly held together. And he was battling on at the end and was game, getting beaten by Trademark. But a horse like this going out for the connections he goes out for, to me, he was supposed to deliver that day. And now I think he's in a tougher spot, difficult pace situation. Is he the kind of horse that really wants to come from 5th or 6th? I don't know about that. And maybe he'll be more forward than that, but he's going to face a faster pace than he's faced in recent starts. So between these two favorites, I trusted National Treasure more. And at similar prices, I wanted to go more in that direction. But that said, I think that others offer way better value in here. So let's start to explore some of those other options, Craig. Like me, I think that you resisted the temptation to put Senor Buscador on top because you see that 20-1 in the morning line and against the bias last time, and this is a horse that's had excuses on multiple occasions, but you still have to take a horse like him that's going to come from last. I mean, that's just his style. He drops back to dead last, and he's going to try to pass everybody, and he's not going to be 20-1 in this race.
No, it's as you said, I did resist the temptation, and it's more for what you were saying earlier. I mean, I have no illusions he's going to be 20-1. I mean, he may be the third choice in this race, I would say. But it goes back to what you said. This is Gulfstream Park. I can't see him anywhere but last early, and that's tough. As you said, I'm playing horses that come from off the pace, but I'm not playing horses that come from way off the pace. I mean, I would use them if I'm playing a pick 5 just in case the race becomes a total meltdown. But for me, that's a very tough move to make at Gulfstream. It's a 1.125 track. It's not the longest stretch. I could see him getting shuffled way back because there's usually a pretty quick dash into that first turn. It comes up really quick. So he's one. What's he going to be? Maybe 5-6-1 if you're lucky in here.
Yeah, I made him 6-1 on my line for this race.
Yeah, I would have probably said 6-1, and that's very rarely something that I want to take on a horse who's just going to be way back there. I liked him last time. I thought it was a good setup. He had some excuses, but I wound up going in a little bit different direction. I look for a horse that is going to come from off the pace, but has shown some more tactical speed, particularly in his last 2, and that's O'Connor for Saffie Joseph. His speed figures fit in here. I think he will get a good inside stalking trip, just like he had in the Harlan's Holiday. I thought he ran fine in the Fayette, and it just seems like things might set up for him if he's able to save ground and just work out a good trip. So that's who I wound up making my top pick. It's not that I love him. I didn't have a morning line at the time. I think he was 8-1 on the morning line or so. That seems reasonable. I wouldn't be shocked if he even drifted up a little from there. And I'm just looking for a good trip from him.
Yeah, I could see a decent trip coming for him. I do wonder if he's not going to be able to stay as close as he did in his last couple of starts when it seemed like he gained some early speed because he was like dropping out the back door in some races, summer into fall, especially that Woodward. And he did stay more engaged in his last couple. And he's definitely kind of figured it out lately. He's been improving recently for Saffie Joseph, and he drew much better than his stablemate, Skippy Longstocking. So, I get the case for him, but Craig, as I was going through my handicapping process and I was watching back some races, as I started to consider O'Connor, and I did legitimately consider him, I was watching back that Fayette, and I don't think you're going to disagree with me that, I mean, Il Miracolo arguably should have won that race. I mean, he got bullied a little bit through the stretch by Tyler on O'Connor, who was just right on top of them, was lugging in. I forget if the stewards looked at it or not. I don't think they did, and they probably should have. But I mean, there was some real hurting through the stretch that day, and Il Miracolo was just kind of bounced around between horses and had trouble really sustaining his momentum. But I mean, he fought on, and he's a gritty horse, and he has been sort of knocking on the door. He ran pretty well in that Pennsylvania Derby. I mean, nobody was beating Saudi Crown that day, but he chased outside wide every step of the way. That's Marty Jones. It was good. I mean, he bolted in the middle of the racetrack to the, coming down the stretch, but I mean, he still ran a fast number that day. And you start to go through and you look back and, he seemed a little ridiculous trying a race like the Belmont Stakes at the time. But, you go back and watch the Belmont and you watch the Florida Derby and, focus more on this horse. At the time, he was kind of an afterthought when you watch those races, but boy, he had real trips in them. The Florida Derby, he had a big trip. He had a trip early in the Belmont Stakes. I mean, he was starting to show those subtle signs of improvement, I think, earlier than people realized. And he's finally started to deliver on the potential. They ran him a lot through the middle of last year, just every single month running this horse. And watching the Clark, to me, it felt like maybe they squeezed the lemon dry a little bit. He was just a little flat that day. But since then, they've come back, given him, 9 weeks off. He's had some time. He's been working at Gulfstream, his home track. He's won at this track before, run some of his best races here. And I like the way he's coming into this race. He gets Javier Castellano aboard. The post, it's not ideal, but I think this field is going to spread out a little bit. So I don't know how wide he's really going to be. And just kind of comparing him to O'Connor, I think he's going to be maybe twice the price of that horse. So I wanted to go for him instead as a better value option.
I have no issue with him. I actually, like you with O'Connor, I considered him because I was a fan of this horse last year. He really came to hand. He actually ran, I think, 11 times last year, which is almost unheard of. For me, it just came down to that post position. The outside posts are pretty tough, but with his running style, I could see it. This is just a race I think you could go in so many different directions. I think I picked Senor Buscador second when we did this. We've already talked about him. Trying to remember some other horses. I said I don't like Hoist the Gold at all. I think you agree with that. A horse that I think
go for it
that we should probably talk about is Dynamic One, who, with his connections, it almost feels like he's going to take money. We talked about him on our preview. He was away for a long time, well over a year. Came back, didn't show a lot. I have no issue with people who are willing to just forgive that race and then go back and say he could run back to some of his better races. For me, I couldn't quite make that leap. You mentioned it before. You like to say, if you cross a race out, would you like him based on his other races? And for me, the answer is probably not. He just is a horse that has absolutely no early speed. It cost him in that comeback race. It's cost him in the past. So I'm not sure how much money this guy's going to take, but being Todd Pletcher and Irad Ortiz, I think it'll probably be more than he should.
Yeah, he's not for me in this race for all the I mean, you made the case for me. I don't have to repeat it. A horse we probably should talk about, Craig, is Trademark. I mean, we talked about the Clark and a couple other horses potentially being interesting out of it. He won that race. And I mean, he did get a very good trip in winning. I mean, he was just in the pocket the entire way. And he's a horse that can really pull on his riders. And I thought that, De La Cruz did a great job just kind of keeping a lid on him the entire way until he peeled him out in the stretch and he unleashed that run. But I mean, if you're able to make an excuse for his Fayette where he didn't show up at all, and I don't know what the excuse was, but that was a real clunker for him. I mean, he's been in really good form other than that. I mean, he arguably ran the best race in the Lucas Classic when he was chasing that fast pace and held on well to just lose by a head in a race that was otherwise dominated by closers. I mean, there's a real case to be made for this horse just being in the best form of his career right now. My issue, Craig, is that I wonder for him if this race is a little bit of an afterthought after they won the big prize last time.
Yeah, it's a tough call for me. Like I said, I'm a little skeptical of the speed figure, but it was a big gap back between second and third. I think it was over 5 lengths back to Il Miracolo. Maybe the speed figure is legit, and if so, it makes him a strong contender. And here he's a horse who has run well close to the pace. He tends to do better when he's actually a little bit off of it, like he was in the Clark. He did similar in the Lucas Classic when just beaten ahead. So I don't want to totally dismiss him. I honestly have no idea what kind of price this horse is going to be in this field. It's a race that if I'm playing verticals, that would probably be a large part of my decision, how much to use him. But I won't be shocked if he runs well here.
Yeah, I mean, I was going through my trip handicapping in this race and kind of deciding who was going to get the right trip in this race. Of all so I can kind of like make some assumptions about how this race is going to be run and who is going to fall into what positions where. The horse that I kind of envision working out the trip that he actually wants to get is Trademark. I mean, I feel like he's going to get the kind of trip that he runs best at what he gets. But I mean, like you said, it does come down to price. He's probably supposed to be more like 8-10 to 1, and he could be higher than that. We'll see. He's another one. It's kind of hard to peg what price he's supposed to be in this race. Craig, I'll go right on to the other horse that I'm interested in betting in this race, and maybe I'm really going off the reservation here. But Croupy is a horse that has been in really good form recently. I know that he was kind of the butt of jokes last year when he was making a foray onto the Triple Crown Trail, but I mean, since he broke his maiden in that race at Monmouth, it just seems like the light bulb's gone on. I mean, it's not just that he's won 4 of his last 5, but maybe the best race he ran during that time was that Pennsylvania Derby, where if you go back and watch the replay of that race, he was launching this big run around the far turn, built up all this momentum, and was going to be a clear third in that race, if not even challenging for a higher position, and just got ridden right into traffic as, Il Miracolo, veered in a little bit and just totally stopped him, and he basically lost momentum at that point, and you couldn't stop and start over that sloppy track at Parks that day. But he was really running at a huge price that day, came back out of that, won the Discovery, and then last time in the Queens County, heading into the clubhouse turn, he got completely sawed off in traffic. And I mean, he arguably would have been closer to the pace than he was. And I think that's the key point to make about Croupy, is that gone are the days when Croupy had to be 20 lengths out of it early. I mean, a big part of that was Kendrick Carmouche, who rode this horse a number of times. And arguably it's more of a disgrace that he was taking off this horse than it was taking off Integration, because it seemed like he's been a big part of Croupy's success. But I mean, he's gotten this horse into the game in the last couple of races. Now, there's going to be a faster pace here, but I don't care about that so much because he's certainly adaptable to come from way out of it when he has to. And I just thought the grit that he showed winning that Queens County last time, especially after that early trouble, was another just step in the right direction for a horse that is going to be a big price in this race. He's not one that's going to drift down off that 20 to 1. I think he's going to drift up. And Frankie Dettori, not the worst replacement in the world. So at a big price, he's one, based on my opinion of him. I just got to use him somewhere. I know he's not the most likely winner of this race, but if I can make a small win bet on him, and I've got to use him in exactas trifectas, because I think he's the kind of horse that could really blow things up, especially underneath.
You made some good points about him. I could see use him in verticals. The post is going to be tough. The criticism, I mean, when he was running on the Triple Crown Trail, that was kind of silly, but you can draw a line through all that stuff. It doesn't matter anymore. He's been a totally different horse, as you said, since he broke his maiden. His last 4 speed figures have been really consistent. I like that he stayed up close recently, and we know that he can finish the race. So maybe he drops back a little further, but I don't think that's the worst thing in the world. I do think he probably would need to save some ground and start moving sooner rather than later. I mean, we talked about it with Senor Buscador. You don't want to be trying to make up 10 lengths in the stretch because it's not going to happen. But I've seen crazier long shots than him, and he's certainly moving in the right direction.
Well, Craig, we've mentioned almost every horse in this race, so I mean, I don't know if there's anybody else that you want to bring up. I anticipate the answer is no. But I think it's time to kind of go back through and talk about how we may play this sequence. And it does feel like the kind of sequence where you want to get involved. I mean, even if your ticket's getting really bloated and you want to kind of go back and reassess things and play something skinnier that just has a chance to hit for a large sum of money, it's the kind of sequence that feels like it really might pay, because a few of these races, they can go in a number of different directions. There are vulnerable favorites in here. So I'll let you lead it off. Just talk about how you might want to go through it.
Before we do, I do want to mention one more horse from that race very quickly. And no, it's fine. It's Skippy Longstocking, just because I think he's a horse that he's been around a long time and he may actually take some money, but we mentioned it on our preview of the race that I just think he's a horse that, of all the horses drawn outside, he's by far taking the worst of it. And I don't like him at all in here. And I know you agree, so I don't want to dwell on it, but I didn't want to overlook. He was the one horse we didn't mention. So.
Well, Craig, yeah, we agree on that. So I'll let you take it away with pick 5 strategy.
Yeah, so pick 5. My thought right now is I would probably do like you said. I would play a smaller ticket looking for a big score, and that's it. I'm going to keep it pretty skinny in some of the early legs. Mary Quay Contrary, I would lean on. Might be a single if I played a couple of smaller tickets, maybe on one ticket, maybe on a different one. I would use Gerrymander as like a B. But that would be it for me in this race. And luckily, we get to see the odds. I mean, if Mary Quay Contrary is 3-5 in here, what's the point? I would just move on to the pick 4, knowing full well it probably has a higher takeout, and there are some negatives to it. I just don't want to start a leg where I'm going almost exclusively through a horse who's just an overwhelming favorite. I just don't see the point. So I would use her if she's, 7-5, 8-5 range. If she gets down below even money, forget it. I would just move on to the pick 4. In the next race, the 10th race, which is, I believe, the Pegasus World Cup Filly and Mare Turf. I would spread a little bit more in this. I would use Didia in here. I would use Queen Goddess, Cairo Consort. I know it's one you didn't like, but I still just see this horse getting a great trip. So I was interested in that one. I'm not going to use Star Fortress. I kind of decided as we were talking about the race, she's just not for me. If she beats me, she beats me. But I would be more interested in using a horse like Ruby Nell, who you brought up, where speed is always dangerous on this Gulfstream Park turf course. And I think she could very well be out there all by herself. So I would spread a little bit. You talked me into surprisingly a little bit. I've got no issue with her, but this is one I would probably spread. I've got no problem using 4 or 5 different horses in here. Moving on to the Hooper. It's one where I'm not going to get too crazy. I would use horses like Accretive and Tumba Rumba as my top 2A horses. I would also use Gilmore. I wouldn't want to get totally knocked out if Hijazi just went to the front and was able to beat this field. And Signator, who you mentioned, he's fine. 12 can get a little dicey when you're going the mile. I mean, I like being drawn outside. That might be a little far, but he's a horse who's moving in the right direction. So I would spread a little bit in that one. The next race, the Pegasus Turf, I'm not going to spread very much at all. I would use Web Slinger and Integration, maybe use Jerry the Nipper as a C, and that's about it. I think there's some filler in there. I think there's some very good horses in there. So I want to stick to them and hope that Warm Heart, I just don't see this working out for her. I could be dead wrong. She's probably going to go off a short price. Maybe she'll be bet along with Integration, as you said, but she's the one I'm against of those two. I much prefer Integration. And then the last race, seeing how I've went short in a couple of the legs, I would spread in here. I'd probably use 4 or 5. Not sure exactly even which ones they would be. O'Connor would be one. He was my top pick. I could see using Trademark. I would use Senor Buscador. Il Miracolo I could use, and maybe even National Treasure if I could get him on a ticket with not too many horses. But it's a wide open race and just kind of comes down to how the rest of my ticket looks. I don't want to go crazy spending a bunch of money on this one.
Yeah, I mean, the strategy that I outlined that you also espoused just there, leaning on Mary Quay Contrary in this first leg, it does give you some other options. And especially if that's your opinion, don't force yourself to get more creative in a race where you're not really viewing it that way from a handicapping standpoint. And I'll also point out, Greg, I know that Saturday is not a mandatory payout day for the Rainbow Six. And typically we preach, only playing the Rainbow Six on mandatory days, though there is some evidence against even that. It's a jackpot wager, which are problematic for a whole set of reasons we're not going to go into right now. But I will say, if you really see a ton of value in this sequence, and you're not in love with this inside information and starting it off, and you want to add some more value to the sequence, I mean, there is the option of starting things off with the McKnight and playing the Rainbow Six, even with that takeout and it not being a mandatory day. I mean, I like a long shot in the McKnight. We did a video of that race that you can find on DRF's YouTube channel. And if you really feel like you're getting a lot of positive value from multiple legs of the sequence, that is a potential avenue for you. I'm not saying that it's necessarily good advice for everybody, but you have a whole palette you can paint with when you come to decide which wagers you're going to play. And it's not one size fits all for everybody. So I just wanted to, mention some different options and different scenarios that you might want to consider. For me, just talking about the pick 5 sequence, inside information, race 9. I'm going to lean on Mary Quite Contrary. Maybe I'll use Intrepid Daydream as a C, but it's a race where I want an A, no Bs, and maybe I'll throw a C or 2 in there. In the 10th race, the Filly and Mare Turf, my A's would be the 6 Ruby Nell and the 9 Didia, and then I would use Fluffy Socks as more of a B, along with potentially surprisingly as a B or a C. And I'm on the fence about whether or not Star Fortress is even a backup. I mean, obviously she could win this race, but the more I was talking about it, Craig, and I guess I convinced you, I was even convincing myself even further that she's probably not the right horse to bet in this race. And, beyond that, there was nobody else that interested me that much. In the Hooper, I'm on the fence here about whether to use multiple A's or just one A. The one A would be the 3 Steel Sunshine, because I think he's going to be the best value. If I used multiples, I could throw in horses like the 11 Tumbarumba and the 12 Signator, but I'm leaning more towards them being B's. Gilmore's a B for me. And then, if I'm going down to the next tier, I mean, obviously horses like Hijazi and Accretive can win, but I'm not viewing them as value horses. And typically for me, when I'm viewing an ABC ticket, like the old Steve Christ or ticket maker method, for me, the way I would define ABC is A is the best value horses, B is the horses that offer some positive value or neutral, and C are the horses that can win or potentially take away some value from the sequence, so that I'm only using those C horses with the horses that I think add a lot of value to my wager. That's how I view ABC. I know some people do it by win percentage or other takes on that, but that's how I think is the best strategy to play an ABC type wager. And then moving on to the Pegasus World Cup Turf, race 12, I'm leaning on integration. And it's kind of a similar situation with Mary Quite Contrary for me. He's the only A for me. I'm probably not using any Bs in this race. And then the Cs for me would be horses like Jerry the Nipper, Web Slinger, and Warm Heart. I think that Jerry the Nipper could offer some value in this race, but just given the likelihood of winning, he's more one that I want to use underneath in some vertical wagers. And then closing things out in the Pegasus World Cup final leg, I'm not going to say it's a spread race because there are horses I really want to emphasize here, those being the 10 Il Miracolo and the 11 Croupi. But there are others I want to get alive to if I'm right in some other legs, like the 5 Trademark. I want to get alive to National Treasure because I think he's likely to win this race. He's probably the most likely winner in my book, and from a value standpoint, he's probably a neutral type. On deeper tickets, I could use a horse like O'Connor. I think he's another sort of neutral value horse that I'm not in love with, but I totally get the case for him. Same thing with Senor Buscador. So, I mean, those are kind of the 6 I could play around with and start to sort out, but definitely the 2 that I think I want to, just upgrade based on value would be the 10 and the 11. So you got to make some tough decisions in the sequence, Craig, because there are a lot of horses that can potentially win and a lot to consider.
Yeah, for sure. I really like how you described the ABC. It's something I've never really put in the words, but I think we're very similar in that. The A horses for me are the ones that I think I'm going to get value from in the sequence. So I'm glad you brought that up. Like I said in the beginning, it's a sequence. You could easily spend a lot of money on a bloated ticket and get knocked out of this sequence, in my opinion. So that's not something that I want to do. I'll definitely be playing these races on Saturday. I just think it's a fascinating betting card. Even before this pick 5 sequence starts, I think there's just some really good races. So I'm really looking forward to it. And I just hope everybody enjoyed listening because these are the kind of cards that we're in the sport for, I think.
Yeah, we definitely spent some time on this one a little longer than our usual podcast, but as you said, I think that this card merited that, and we only examined a chunk of it. I mean, just the late pick five, but I mean, there's interesting racing throughout the day at Gulfstream, and like we said at the top of the show, if you've got those strong opinions throughout the day, and you want to up your investment, I mean, just be aware that Pegasus World Cup betting championship, you can still buy your way in. $6,000 is the buy-in. First is seeding the prize pool of $50,000. Of that 6,000 buy-in, 5,000 is your tournament bankroll, and then 1,000 goes towards the prizes. So potential $250,000 prize pool with 200 players. Prizes, you've got obviously a lot of money, BC seats, NHC seats to the new Ultimate Betting Challenge. And if you want to play it, you could do so online at ExpressBet, on track at Gulfstream or Santa Anita. Just go to pwcbc.com to get more information and to register for the tournament. So Craig, a lot going on this weekend. I'm looking forward to all the racing. Good luck to everybody who listened and has their own ideas about how they're going to play. I hope that you attack it and are successful, and looking forward to taking all this racing in on the big weekend, Craig, and we'll be back to do a recap next week.
Yeah, looking forward to talking about it. Hopefully we get some big speed figures. That always makes my weekend.
Well, everybody, thanks for tuning in to the podcast this week. Remember, you can always catch these TimeformUS podcasts on DRF.com, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. Wherever you get your podcasts, just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Again, thanks for listening, and make sure to catch Greg and I back with our recap of Pegasus World Cup weekend on the Pacecast coming up next Tuesday.